This evening, we're going to take some time to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Particularly, we're going to focus on verses 1 through 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 14. Now, what we're going to notice is that the scars of others are good teachers for us. Now, that's an interesting thing to consider. But the scars of others, or even the scars we have ourselves, can be very effective teachers for us. And as we work through this passage, we're going to notice that Paul is going to keep looking back into the Old Testament at examples of what the Israelites did, particularly decisions they made that were bad. And he's going to say those are our examples today. Now, that word used as example literally means a scar. That is a mark left by a wound. In the scripture bears the scars of the Israelites' decisions. And you see, when you see somebody's scar, you can say, how did you get that scar? We'll often ask that, and they can tell you, and you'll be careful from then on. An example that happened recently, so I'll pick on Robert for a minute. He was walking out of his apartment and got his knee hung on a brick wall outside, a little sharp brick wall, ripped a big chunk out of his shin. And everybody kept asking him after that, what happened to your leg? Did you have a bicycle wreck? That's what they kept asking him. And he told them, no, I got hung up on this brick wall. Now, you see, they noticed the scar. And when he told them what put that there, you can be pretty sure that the next time they were going by a small brick wall with a sharp corner, they thought, I better be careful not to catch my shin on that corner right there. That is the purpose of scars. And that is the purpose of the Old Testament for us today. We can look at what they did and we can see the result of it. And we can then look at our own life and say, I'm not going to make that same choice. I'm not going to make that same decision. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if we think about our context, back in chapter 9, Paul ends out in verse 27 by the startling statement when he says, I keep under my body and I bring it into subjection, lest that by any means when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. That is, Paul was looking ahead to the finish line, and he said, I don't want to arrive and be rejected at the end. I don't want to be disqualified. He's been talking about the analogy of a race. You can see that in verse 26 when he said, I therefore so run, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. And he's saying that he lived a certain way because he was looking to the finish line, and even someone like Paul, if he had walked away from God, he could have been lost in the end. And so he was looking to that finish line. He wanted to run a good race, and he wanted to complete it. And so with this idea of being a castaway, he is now going to take our attention, and he is going to divert it back to the Old Testament, and he is going to draw upon multiple examples of the Israelites and things they did, and we are going to make application of it in our own life. So if we begin here in chapter 10, verse 1, the first thing that Paul is going to prove to us is that the Israelites were saved. That's the first thing he's going to prove. They were saved as saved could be. So let's begin reading 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. What Paul is doing here is he is showing us that they were saved. The first way he does it is in verse 1. He says that all of our fathers were under the cloud. Now, if you go back in the Old Testament, and I have all the verses on your sheet that you can go home and you can read all this that we're going to talk about. But the cloud went before the Israelites, and it was a symbol of God's guidance. He guided them with that cloud. And what he's showing here is that these people had actually experienced God's guidance. They had been guided by God to where they needed to be. And he says they were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Now, the reference to passing through the sea is, of course, their crossing of the Red Sea. And that speaks to God's salvation. He saved them from the Egyptians. He delivered them when they passed over the sea. So not only had they experienced God's guidance, they had experienced God's salvation in passing through this sea. So they were saved as much as they could possibly be. You also notice here that he makes mention in verse 2, he says, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That is, by following Moses through this, they were putting themselves in subjection under him, under his leadership. Now, the same thing happens when we're baptized into Jesus. When we take his guidance, when we follow where he leads, when we do what he wants us to, and when we're baptized, we are baptized into Christ. That is, we're baptized into obedience to him. And we live as Christians following him with him as our head, and we are his body, obeying and doing what he says. Now, you'll notice in verse 3 that Paul then goes on to note, he says they did all eat the same spiritual meat. Now, that right there is a reference to the manna in the Old Testament. It's called spiritual food because it come down from God. It was supernatural. You know, manna was not like flour. It was not that God just made up a special kind of flour for them and provided them with it. This was something that was supernatural, and therefore it is called spiritual food. And what he's doing here is he's saying not only had these people experienced God's salvation in his guidance and in crossing the sea and seeing the salvation, they experienced God's provision after salvation. These people were actually delivered, and God took care of these people. And they were provided for by God, and they got to enjoy this salvation from God. And so he says they did all eat the same spiritual meat. That's a reference to manna. And in verse 4, he says they did all drink the same spiritual drink. Now, this is a reference most likely to the rock that is talked about back in Exodus 17, 1 through 7. The people complained that they didn't have water. And God told Moses to take his staff and to strike that rock, and the rock split and the water would come forth for the people. Now that, again, was spiritual drink because it was supernatural. Water does not come out of a rock like that, and a rock does not split when it's hit with a staff. It comes straight from God. And since it was a supernatural from God, it showed his providing for his people who were saved, and that's why it's called spiritual drink in this passage here. And so Paul is proving here these people were as saved as they could be. And you can see that not only in that they followed God and what he said to do in crossing the Red Sea and being delivered, but even after that, God provided for them with the manna that he gave and with the spiritual drink, that is the water from the rock. And verse 4 says they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was Christ. Now, it is very common throughout the scriptures to find God referred to as the rock, especially in the Psalms. There's other places we'll find it too, but it refers to God's strength and his unmovability, the fact that God is eternal. That's what it focuses on, and so he is often called the rock. It is also interesting to note that when we look through the New Testament, there are many times that looking back, when we look back at especially the Israelites coming out of Egypt, that it is said of them that Jesus was the one who was communicating with them. This is one example here, when it says very clearly there that they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Another one that sticks out to me is in Hebrews chapter 11, when it talks about Moses, when he esteemed the suffering reproach for Christ of more value than all the riches in Egypt. And so we see many of these places throughout the scriptures. And so in these first 4 verses, Paul has just showed us these people were definitely saved, first off. So we cannot say that the Israelites were not saved, but we need to establish that they were as saved could be, because things are going to take a bad turn here. And we need to notice what happens. Beginning in verse 5 and continuing through verse 10, we're going to notice that in spite of the fact that they were saved, in spite of the fact that they were provided for and enjoyed salvation, they sinned against God. God was not pleased by what they did, and they're going to actually be punished for what they did. And it's going to be a harsh punishment. And this is going to be the lesson for us, where Paul is going to make application. Notice what he says in verse 5. He says, but with many of them, that is, in spite of all these privileges, in spite of them being saved, with many of them, God was not well pleased. That means God was not happy with them. They were not acceptable to him. He did not agree with how they were living. And because he was not pleased, it says they were overthrown in the wilderness. So even after saving them and delivering them, because of the choices they made and the things they did, we are going to see them wind up destroyed and overthrown. Now, in verse 6, he says, these things were our examples. And that word examples there is the Greek word typos, T-Y-P-O-S. And that is the word that means type. Now, this is the word that meant scar back in their language. And the idea was it meant to strike, was the idea behind it. And when you were struck, you'd have that bruise, you'd have that scar. And that's why they started using the word type when they would print, because of the way that they would type the paper. That's where the word comes from. It was an action that leaves a mark. And when it says these things were our examples, that means we can look to what happened to them, and we can gain profitable, applicable information from it on how we should behave. These things were our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Now, lust refers to a strong desire. Now, when we look at the word itself in the scripture, it is not always after something evil. There are some places where it's used of something good. For instance, when Jesus said, with great desire, I've desired to eat this meal with you. That was the word lust right there. But it was not over a sinful thing, so it's not translated into English as lust. It's a strong desire, or even crave would be a good way to translate this word. But notice here it says, these things were written to the intent that we today should not desire evil things, just as they desired after evil things. Now that is a broad general statement. They lusted after many evil things, and there are many things in this world that we could lust after. And all the things that they had trouble with, we're still living in the same world today and can have trouble with. And so he is saying these things are written so that we can look and so that we can learn. Now, he's going to get very specific here. He's going to list 4 sins from the Old Testament. And we're going to take a look at each one of these sins, and we're going to consider what we can learn from these and why Paul may have listed them. In verse 7, he says, neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Turn with me over to Exodus chapter 32. Exodus chapter 32. We're here going to zoom in on the sin of idolatry. Exodus chapter 32, this is when Moses is up on Mount Sinai. And we'll begin reading in verse 1. Exodus 32, 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we know not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation, and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink, and rose up to play. And that last sentence right there is the one that Paul quotes here. Now, what does it mean when he says that they rose up to play? We can understand that by looking at verse 18. When Moses is talking to Joshua up on the mountain, he said, It is not the voice of them that shout for mastery, neither is it the voice of them that cry for being overcome, but the noise of them that sing do I hear. And it came to pass, as soon as he came into the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. So that's what it means, they rose up to play. They often, in idolatry, they worshiped and served these false gods through dancing and through singing and such as that. And this is exactly what they were doing. Now, why did they fall into this idolatry? Did we get what caused them to do it? You'll find it there in verse 1. It says, the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount. They gathered themselves unto Aaron and said, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. See, they were insecure. They said, what are we going to do? And they panicked. They didn't have faith. They started to doubt. And so they veered off of where God needed them to be and veered into idolatry. Now, we got to be careful with ourselves. If we get insecure, when we get to worrying, There's people who set up idols today. They may not be thinking of that idol as a god, but there may be something they're relying on instead of God, and that becomes their idol. They're insecure about something, and so they maybe start stockpiling all this money up or whatever it might be. And so we've got to be careful of idols that we might find in our own life. This was extremely applicable for the Corinthians here because they were dealing with the problem of how to interact with those who were wanting them to come and to eat out of worship to an idol. And so in 1 Corinthians 10:7, he says, do not be idolaters as they were. We can look at that example right there, and we can see the scar. How did it turn out for the Israelites falling into idolatry there? God punished them for it. And so that is an example for us. In 1 Corinthians 10, if we look in verse 8, we move on to the second example Paul gives. He says, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. 23,000 is a lot of people to die in one day. And the cause for it was the fornication they committed. Well, we find this account back in Numbers chapter 25. Numbers chapter 25. This is what it says here. Numbers 25, we'll begin reading in verse 1. It simply says, and Israel abode in Shittim, and people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. Now this is interesting. Revelation chapter 2, verse 14 tells us that Balaam recommended to Balak to send down some women from his company to intermarry with the Israelites and to lead them away into idolatry. You can also find that there in Numbers 31:16. And so this is what happened to people. They began to intermarry with these women of Moab, and these women led the Israelites away from God into these idols. Notice verse 2, it says, and they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, that is the Moabites' gods. And the people did eat, and they bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, take all the heads of the people, that is, the leaders of the people, and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor. Now Baal Peor was the false god the Moabites worshipped. Verse 6, and behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. Now you look at that example and you say, how does God feel about fornication? I mean, he does not like it at all. It's a severe thing. Look how strict God reacted. These Israelites were saved. They were delivered. But they turned into the sin of fornication, and God punished them for it. They were overthrown. Did you notice verse 9 says, and those that died in the plague that God had sent were 24,000? That's a lot of people. That's more than the population of the city of Winchester. That many people died in one day because of the sin of fornication. You see, we look at that, and when we look at this Old Testament example, we can see just how God views that kind of sin. And we can say we need to avoid it at all costs. It is not okay, and it is not acceptable. It's a bad, bad thing. Now, back in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, did you notice that when Paul quotes it, he said, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000? You notice Paul says 23,000, and Numbers back there said 24,000. You know why? If you notice, when Paul says it here, he says there fell 23,000 in one day. That's how many died in one day. Altogether, there's 24,000. So that's the difference in the two numbers right there. Paul's saying that many people, 23,000, they died in one day. But the plague itself claimed 24,000 in its entirety. Some people will say that's a contradiction, but it just takes close reading there. The next one to notice back in 1 Corinthians 10 is verse 9. Verse 9 simply says, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Now, when we use the word temptation, we talked about it this morning. When we use it with man, it's usually in reference to whether man will sin or not. When it's used in reference to God, it has to do with his patience most of the time. We're trying God's patience, or we're tempting God's patience. We're seeing how far we can go. We just keep on continuing on in this sin, or keep on doing this activity that we know to be wrong. The Israelites just kept on and kept on. They truly tempted Christ. Let's look at Numbers 21. As people who have been saved, as people who've been forgiven, we should look at our sin and we should run from that sin. We should not try to keep on doing that sin and tempt God and test God and try God and see how long he'll let us go in it. We need to absolutely abandon it. In Numbers chapter 21, we'll begin reading in verse 4. Numbers 21:4. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses. Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. Now you'll notice they're complaining a lot. They're really upset, and they've done it over and over and over. And every time they do this, they are testing God's patience. And notice what happens in verse 6. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people. And much people of Israel died. God reacted to that sin harshly, didn't he? He wasn't okay with it. He didn't just let it slide. These people were saved, yet they chose to sin, and God punished them for it. Verse 7, Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Jesus refers to this in John chapter 3 in reference to himself and how we are saved. But for the moment, let us notice they tested God. They tried God's patience, and God punished them for it. That's a sin. We should be careful not to test Christ. And we got to look at our own life and say, where in my life am I testing Christ? Or am I testing him in any way? Am I not living like I ought to? Am I not turning away from this sin? Am I dragging it around and testing God's patience? That's a good question. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul is going to list one more incident for us. And notice how particular he is with these incidents. He's really applying this to drive it home. 1 Corinthians 10:10, he says, Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now, what does it mean to murmur? It means to complain. That's what it means. It means to complain. How does God feel about complaining? God does not like complaining. And we're about to see just how harshly God views it. Turn over to Numbers. I'm going all the way back to Numbers here. We're going to go back to Numbers chapter 16. Numbers chapter 16, we're going to see how God views this murmuring. Now, this is going to be the account of Korah. Numbers chapter 16, Korah spoke up against how God had ordained things. He was trying to put himself and his company in a position that God had not allowed. And in verse 31, we're going to first notice what happens to Korah for some context. Numbers 16 and 31, And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under him. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. And they and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit. And the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them. For they said, Lest the earth swallow us up also. And there came out a fire from the Lord, and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. God's dealing with sin here. These were the people he saved out of Egypt. Yet they sinned, and God punished them. Notice verse 41. But on the morrow, all the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. Now they're complaining against them, saying, "You have killed the people of the Lord." They're blaming them for it. Verse 42, "And it came to pass, when the congregation was gathered against Moses and against Aaron, that they looked toward the tabernacle of the congregation, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And Moses and Aaron came before the tabernacle of the congregation. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Get you up from among this congregation, that I may consume them, as in a moment. And they fell upon their faces. And Moses said to Aaron, Take a censer, put fire therein from off the altar, and put on incense, and go quickly into the congregation, and make an atonement for them, for there is wrath gone out from the Lord. The plague is begun. And Aaron took, as Moses commanded, ran into the midst of the congregation, and behold, the plague was begun among the people. And he put on incense, and made an atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stayed. And they that died in the plague were 14,700, beside them that died about the matter of Korah. And Aaron returned unto Moses unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and the plague was stayed. You see how God reacted to their sin? I mean, look how many people, 14,700 died like that. Not even counting the ones that happened in Korah. You see, that's how God views sin. And what kind of sin was we talking about here? Paul said, let us not murmur as they murmured. Do we look at complaining as that bad of a thing? You know, when we're murmuring, when we're grumbling, we've got to be careful and realize sin is a serious matter. And even though we're saved, we need to be careful because God will punish sin. Notice verse 10. 1 Corinthians 10:10 now. This is the last one. He says, Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. This reference to the destroyer seems to be the same reference to the one who, the angel that destroyed all the firstborn in Egypt back in Exodus chapter 12. Although reading in the count of Numbers, it seems it was done through a plague of some sort. So now, after noticing idolatry, fornication, testing Christ, murmuring, all these are sins that these saved people did and that God punished them for. The fact that they were saved did not make it okay to live however they wanted. In light of this, going into verse 11, Paul is going to start making application for you and me today. And notice what he says here, 1 Corinthians 10:11. He says, Now all these things, not just some of them, he said, all these things happened unto them for ensamples. And that's our word, examples. That is the word that means a scar. And they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now, what does the word admonition mean? The word admonition means a warning. That's what it means. It's a warning for us. And you see, when we look at what they did, we see the result of what happened. We see how God responded. And we look at that, and then we look at ourselves and say, you know, I don't want to do that same thing because I don't want the same thing to happen to me. It helps us understand the seriousness of sin and the seriousness of doing these wrong things. All these things happen for examples, and that's why we have an Old Testament in our Scripture. We do not live by it. It does not give us the rules to follow. It's not what we're going to be judged by, but it gives us the examples. It gives us scars. It gives us wounds to look at, and we can see how they got there, and it gives us a warning. Now, it's interesting, but verse 12 is a powerful statement here. It says, Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. You're never closer to falling as when you think you can't. You know, you take an icy driveway. This is just an earthly example. You know, you look at an icy driveway. If one person can slip on it, somebody else can slip on it. There's nobody immune to slipping on an icy driveway. You can't look at it and say, I didn't slip on it last year when it was icy, so I don't have to be careful this year. You know, you've got to realize that if we think we're standing, we're in more danger of falling. We need to approach with caution. You know, those Israelites could not say, I can do whatever I want. I'm safe because I was in Egypt and God guided me out with his cloud. And then he brought me and delivered me from the Israelites by crossing the sea. And then he loves me so much, he provided for me with manna and he gave me water from the rock. You see, I'm completely in his good graces. I don't have to worry about falling. That's not true at all. We've got to be careful. Their scars should warn us. We're never closer to falling than when we think that we cannot fall. We always need to take heed. That's the word used there. Take heed. We need to take caution and beware. Paul was aware of the danger. And back in chapter 9, verse 27, when he said, "Lest I myself should be a castaway." And if Paul could sin and fall away, we can. And so we need to be ever so careful. Now, if you notice down there in verse 13, he makes the statement that there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. Now you'll notice in 13, he says, there has no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. This world is full of temptations. It's common to man. And we should not be surprised when we encounter temptations, because it's common and it's part of life. But there's two things to remember. The first to remember is that temptation will come. The second to remember is that God is faithful. That means he's reliable. That is, when the temptation comes, it's not just us against the temptation, but God is there with us. He's faithful. He's there for us through these temptations. And God helps us in our temptations. And there are two ways mentioned in this verse in which God helps us. It says he will not suffer you to be tempted above that we are able. You know, God knows what every single one of us can handle. He knows what every single one of us can bear. And God will limit that temptation so that it is not more than we can handle. There will never be a temptation to sin that you are physically or spiritually or mentally unable to say no. Because God will limit it. He will not let a temptation greater than that come to you. Now, one thing we do have to specify is that temptation sometimes refers to trouble in life, trials of life. But sometimes it refers to temptations in regard to sin. This is referring to sin in this passage. If we look at the whole previous context, it's all talk about the Israelites' sin. You know, there are some temptations in life that I think are just about too big for us to bear. You know, you can't always handle all the hardships that come through life. Sickness would be one of these and other things like that. But when it comes to temptation in regard to sin, God will never let the temptation be so great that we cannot say no to it. And those Israelites, they didn't have to give in. They didn't have to choose to commit fornication. They didn't have to choose to murmur. They didn't have to keep testing God. They could have realized the situation, took caution, and not have fell. And so we need to look at their example and say, God is faithful and he's here for me. And yes, this temptation is common, but it's not more than I can handle, so I can say no to it. The other thing to notice here is it says, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. That is, when temptation comes, we can escape it. We can get away from it. We can bear it. Now, the problem is that oftentimes we don't look for the escape. We have to try. We have to care. And it may take a lot of effort and a lot of pain. We may be like Joseph as he ran away from Potiphar's wife. He literally had to run. And did you notice in verse 14 there what Paul says? He says, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. Sometimes we have to literally run from temptation. You know, one of the worst things you can do is to put yourself up under something you know you can't resist and try to do it anyway. You don't do that. If you don't think you can handle the situation, you ought to run from it when it comes to temptation. If you don't think you're strong enough to say no to it, you shouldn't put yourself around it. We would see this with alcohol many times, you know. If you don't think that you could resist drinking it, then you don't go to where it's being served. Instead, when you see it coming, you run. Do what Joseph did and go the other way. God, he's faithful. And although temptation is common, he will not let that temptation be above what we can handle. And he will always provide a way out so that we can bear it. So we don't have to be like the Israelites. We can look at their scars and say, I'm not going to do the same thing that gave them those scars. I can learn from their wounds. And that's something that we need to remember when we look through the Old Testament. We understand the physical analogy of scars, and scars are noticeable. You know, they stick out, and that's why people notice them. If you have a scar on your hand, every time you look at that hand or every time you see that scar, you may say, hey, I remember that incident. That's where I did, and you can fill in the blank. And we can look at these incidents in the Old Testament and say, you can see what they did right there, and you can see the result of it. I ain't doing that. You know, if somebody reaches in the oven and takes out a hot pan of cornbread without an oven mitt, they're going to holler. And that's the best teacher for you, to not reach in the oven without an oven mitt when you remove the pan. When we see something, it really hits home and it really gets in our hearts. That's what the Old Testament is for, to hit home and to get into our hearts. If there's anybody here tonight who wants to become a Christian, we always have the time. Jesus died on the cross to save you, and there isn't any reason why you shouldn't be right with God today. So you shouldn't delay that. You should make sure you get right with Him as soon as you're able. And if there's anybody here who is a Christian, but you want us to pray for you because you've not been living how you think you ought to, and you want to be right with God, you can come forward and make that known as we stand up and as we all sing together.
You're always God, no sin to hide, but you have sent Him from the side to walk upon this guilty sod, and to become the Lamb of God. The Lamb of God, sweet Lamb of God, I love the holy Lamb of God. Oh, wash me in His precious